Hey, welcome everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Uh, I'm here with Josh City from 86 Boxing. We're going to be discussing the rivalry between the great Sam Langford and the also great Jack Johnson. 86, what's up, man?
Cheers, random cheers. All is good. Hope all is well on your end. This is going to be a great discussion. Two great fighters, two fighters that many boxing fans have opinions on. And if you're opinionated, then you're in the right place because we're going to talk about it.
Absolutely, man. It's great to have you. Shout out to the Boxing Librarian and Scrapbook Boxing. What's up, fellas? So what we wanted to do is they had one fight between these two all-time greats. They fought once in 1906. There were numerous attempts to rematch them throughout the years, especially during Johnson's once he had unified the white and the colored heavyweight championship in 1908. There were just massive efforts from multiple promoters on multiple continents to rematch these two, and it never came about, which for reasons, myriad reasons that we will get into. But in this first episode, what we want to try and do is get through the early parts of their careers, especially up to and including the part where Langford debuts a pro. Now, Josh, quickly, do you want to talk about just for a minute about like we don't have the complete picture. Okay, this isn't like the 1920s or 30s where there's a more complete reporting and that the boxing is more widely accepted, especially in the United States where these two were fighting at this time. There's a lot of stuff we don't know. We know we don't know. This year, I found a fight of Sam Langford's that was previously unmentioned on any website I'd seen. That was, I believe, March of 1903, his 1903 season, his first full season. Langford started in '02. Johnson, I think, according to Cyber Boxing Zone, one of our two sources for this, BoxRec and Cyber, on Cyber, Johnson's first fight was 1894, I think. But there's a very sparse record of those first few years. And Josh, you just want to say a few words on what we know we don't know, like what we might be missing.
Yeah, so you make a great point. I would akin boxing during that time a lot like when we had the prohibition on alcohol. So you had to know where to get it. It probably wasn't going to be anywhere flashy, and you had to know some people. You know what I'm saying? And that's similar. That's similar to the way boxing was, of course, during the time, especially when you went from state to state. As we all know, boxing still varies depending on the state as far as what things are implemented, what rules are implemented, things of that nature, what aren't. And so with a lot of these fighters from that time, you probably had a lot of backdoor stuff, a lot of under the table type of agreements that were taking place. The fights were taking place in places that were not the typical places that you would expect a fight to take place. And it was probably in smaller rooms than you would expect a fight to be by comparison today. But it was the norm there, and especially for a number of the sort of rugged fighters, those that were looking to build their name. They didn't really have that backing, and they were working their way towards getting that backing. You best believe that, similar to how it is today, you just don't pop up overnight in most cases. There are those that are always seemingly watching and looking to put themselves in place to capitalize off of a great talent. So if you were making waves back then in the underground scene, essentially, then opportunities would come about. Now, that doesn't mean that a level playing field would come about, but certainly opportunities in themselves would come about. And you could make more money than you would make on a typical job doing the typical trade at the time. And I think that is essentially what lured so much talent into boxing. That's what lured Johnson into boxing, and I'd imagine it probably is the thing that lured Sam Langford into boxing as well. And I think that's just kind of the way it is with anything. We have more options today here with the varying sports and the amount of money that you can make. But if we look at the history of just sports in general, we know that boxing has that long lineage because of the fact that it's something that people clamored to. And we've been lucky enough to have enough records to be able to track it from its early existence up to now. Everything, of course, isn't 100% perfect, much like we don't know every waking detail of every other sport that started from its infancy. But in boxing, of course, we do have many accounts that we can draw back on, and that's what makes this rivalry or lack thereof, what could have been between Johnson and Langford, special. And we'll be looking to kind of touch on what led them to their faithful meeting at the point that they did end up fighting, and what led to them actually not having that rematch, and what could have been had it gone down.
Yeah, absolutely. Well put, sir. Yeah, so folks, we're not, this isn't supposed to be the definitive version of these two great legends' careers. We don't know their whole career. What I did is I went to Cyber Boxing Zone and got both their records because Cyber wonderfully lists exhibitions and certain other facts that may not be on BoxRec, but then BoxRec also puts the consensus like result according to the newspapers that were on the scene for fights, for no decision fights. So you can get the newspaper decision wins and losses. So combination of these two, please forgive any typos. I did this in and amid a very busy schedule. My favorite mixed rules fighter of all time, Fedor, competed this last weekend. So a lot of my attention was on the Bellator mixed martial arts fight league. So I've been swinging back and forth. We had a couple delays in this, but we thought we just need to go ahead and do it. So shout out to the chat. Thanks everyone for joining us during and also after the fact. So 86, we know that Langford, his as far as we know, he started fighting in 1902, amateur, and then also turned pro in '02 with a single pro fight against a former amateur opponent. But with Johnson, it goes a lot further back. And as we know, we don't have complete records. Like, do we think he only actually fought twice in 96 and twice in 97? No, it's very unlikely. Now, is it safe to say he probably didn't have significant fights during that time? Quite possibly. Although, you know, for boxing, all you need is an area to fight in, some rich patrons who want to fight, who want to bet in private. You could have a fight that wouldn't necessarily be advertised, but for the large part, we could say that we're going to be able to touch on the major fights each of these great fighters had as far as what's likely to ever be known. So what would you say? How would you sum up? We're going to move quite quickly through the early part of his career, but up from 94 through 99, what thoughts do you have on what, as he's gathering experience and he's already had a hard life, what can we say about these few years for him, Josh?
Yeah, so as I was mentioning previously, Johnson was likely looking at the type of money that could come with him competing in the sport of boxing. I remember a documentary stating that he had actually run into another fighter who, this was before he started, who seemed to be well dressed and had some money in his pocket, which at the time was the thing that, of course, everyone was looking for. And Johnson asked him, and he told him what he did, and that kind of hooked in. And Johnson was for that from the jump. So he started out much like a lot of the fighters back then. You really had to take what you could get, and you never knew if you were going to be fighting someone who was on your level, below your level, or above your level. And most oftentimes, it was going to be above your level. So for the early part of Johnson's career, uh, there were some focal point fights leading to 1899, which was probably the year where he first made an impact, at least to start to get his name out there a bit more. And that essentially transpired with him taking on Klondike John Haynes in Chicago. This was in May of 1899, and this was actually a loss for Jack Johnson, but of course, early in his career. And you would see that a lot with some of these guys because, as mentioned, there was no barometer or like, hey, we have to get you to this point. It was just pretty much you were just thrown in there. And at the time, Klondike John Haynes, upon beating Johnson, he declared himself the black heavyweight champion. So you'll see mention of a black heavyweight title out there and it's one that never truly gained traction. As a matter of fact, as far as the little bit of lineage that it did have, Klondike Haynes was one who claimed it, and subsequently he would lose to Frank Childs, who, in a sense, took claim over from Klondike Haynes, but that was overshadowed, of course, by the World Colored Heavyweight Championship, which has a lineage that goes back to the mid to late 1870s when C.C. Smith, so Charles A.C. Smith, you'll see it spelled as that as well. I have a video of him on the page, but he was the first to make a claim for the colored world heavyweight title. And of course, he would substantiate that by opening a challenge to any and all. And of course, that's where it was essentially established. If you want to track it back to the true point when we started hearing mention of the colored heavyweight title. And this title would go on to be fairly prestigious in name because of the fact that there were a lot of the top black fighters who ended up uh, competing for and winning it, from the likes of the Black Prince Peter Jackson. He had the second longest reign behind the likes of Harry Wills, and those are two individuals we know about who were prominent in their time. So Klondike Haynes, he was the first kind of test for Johnson at that time, early on, and Johnson lost, but I think he probably learned a bit more in that loss than uh, what would be known than what he lost. I think he gained more in that loss than what would have been gained had he gone against someone who didn't really test him, rather. And and I think that's what helps to build a fighter, and I think Johnson benefited from it, and we'll see more examples of how he benefited from such as we go on. So he was eventually able to get back in with Klondike Haynes, and he was able to get a draw with him. And this was in 1900. There was a draw over 20 rounds, and this was a fight that Johnson, he went back to the table, made some adjustments, and that helped him to elevate himself a little bit more before they rematched for a third time when Johnson was able to get his definitive victory uh, over Klondike John Haynes, and he knocked him out. And I think this proved to be sort of the shining light moment as far as, okay, Johnson was likely feeling himself at this point and telling himself that, you know what, I can do something in this sport. And this was an opportunity for him to go ahead and continue to make his name there. But of course, the probably most popular fight from that time for Johnson would actually come in 1901, and that would be his February 25th loss to the great Joe Chowinski, the California Terror, representing San Francisco, California. And this actually went down in Galveston, in Johnson's hometown, as a matter of fact. And as we all know, Chowinski was a light heavyweight, competing at heavyweight. He wasn't a huge guy. He's about 6 foot, so between 5'11", 6 foot. I think I've seen some records that say 6'1", but he's more of the slender type. That being said, he actually, he was used to fighting guys that were bigger than him, and he was known to be what some would consider a scientific boxer because he was pretty light on his feet. He could move very well, and he knew all of the tricks and trades as far as just the craftiness you needed to compete with anyone in the sport, whether they were bigger, smaller, regardless. He just had the type of tool set that would translate now. And he often goes underrated. He didn't win a world title, though he, in all likelihood, would have won one had the, I would say, light heavyweight title and lineage been fully established at that particular time. But he was certainly one of those great fighters that never won a world title. And Joe Chawinski knocked him out in 3 rounds. And famously, both fighters were arrested. We do have a photo that floats around every so often showing the two fighters while they were in jail. And at that time, as legend has it, Johnson, he was more of an offensive fighter, and often offense can sometimes get reckless, and that's what Chawinski was able to capitalize on and ended up knocking him out with Johnson being bigger than Chawinski. So while he and Chawinski were locked up for about a month, they would spar, they would train together. The warden or sheriff actually, uh, from my understanding and what based on what I've read, they would open up the actual jail to allow some people in to actually watch them as they were going through these trainings and these sparring sessions. And Johnson was able to learn a great deal from a guy who, when you just look about boxing and that time period that they were in, this was a guy who was a very knowledgeable fighter as far as the sport is concerned. So Johnson was able to benefit from this, and they would eventually be released. Of course, March 22nd was the date. They were both released on bond, and of course, Johnson, he would jump back into the mix. And another fight of note he took there in 1901 was on August 14th against Mexican Pete Everett in Denver, or Victor, Colorado, rather. And now it should be noted that BoxRec shows this fight as being on August 14th, 1901, but the Cyber Boxing Zone shows it as being in September of 1902, which we'll see as we move more towards that area. And the Mexican Pete Everett, if you're familiar with him, and if you're not, of course, there's a video out there on him that I did for 86 Boxing, but he was a big puncher for the time. You look at his record; it's nothing glamorous. He struck me as one of those guys who probably didn't train in the way that he properly should have for as far as keeping himself conditioned, but he had the type of power that allowed for him to get away with such in some sense, because in his around 28 victories, it's either 28 or 27 victories, he knocked out all but one of his opponents, if I'm not mistaken. So he had the type of pop and power that had he put more effort into being more disciplined, he probably could have done even more things. But Johnson was able to draw with Mexican Pete Everett, and I think this would have benefited him as well, because this is someone that he would have been able to learn from, who was a big puncher, and he would have shown that despite what happened with him and Chawinski, he made some changes, and that seemed to help ensure that he didn't suffer that same fate with Mexican Pete Everett, who was a bigger guy, depending on the weight. There were times when he came in at some larger weights. I think this was towards the probably second half of his of Pete Everett's career, towards the back end of the second half. So he was a guy who would put on weight, and I think this would have certainly benefited him, as mentioned. And that, of course, led to his two 1901 fights with Hank Griffin, who I know for sure would have been another fighter he would have benefited from and learned from, because of the fact that Hank Griffin is one of these guys he was one of the black heavyweights at the time, who was very well traveled, of course, much like Johnson and some of the others. Tough start from the jump. Griffin had been in with the likes of, not saying at this particular time, but Griffin was one of those guys who was in with uh, James Jeffries, for instance. And as a matter of fact, he ended up fighting Jeffries in the midst of Jeffries' reign, though it wasn't for the actual world title, but it happened in the midst of his reign. But anyway, this was one of the early tests for Jack Johnson. And of course, Not to knock on wood, but I have a video out there on Hank Griffin where you could kind of get more of a slight understanding of who he was as a fighter. Not a big name, not someone that if you're just looking over a paper, it's not a name that's gonna of boxers of the past. It's not a name that's gonna stand out, but boxing is littered with individuals of his type who were contenders of their time, who didn't get the same amount of fanfare as some of the more popular boxers, but they had a job and they knew how to do that job, apply that trade. And I think that kind of sums up the type of fighter that Hank Griffin was. And so Jack Johnson lost to him in his first fight and actually drew with them in their second fight, both happening in 1901. Now, Griffin was a little bit shorter in height than Johnson, if I recall correctly. But Griffin, as mentioned, he is a very battle tested fighter who was in with a lot of top names from the time. And the way it works, of course, as we all know, you're only as good as your competition. So you can be 100, you can be 100 and 0, but if you haven't fought anybody, it doesn't matter because at some point you're truly going to be tested, and it's about what you're able to do once you get to that point. So I think that all of this just kind of highlights what Johnson's schedule was like there early on, which often gets misconstrued because of what people see on film from when he won the title actually. But prior to that, you really have to dig back and look into what Johnson had to go through to get to that point. And I think that some of these names mentioned, and of course I can't go through all of them, but as if you continue to research and kind of look into them, you'll understand that these were guys who were experienced and they were beneficial to helping Johnson get to that point. And those that see the bravado, the confidence that Johnson had, this is the reason because by the time that he got to the point of the title, then he'd pretty much gone through and fought guys who he himself would have deemed more formidable than what was presented at the time, outside of course, those same very guys that he didn't give a title shot, but we'll dive into that more.
Yeah, that's a great point. That like we don't know the full record, especially like Hank Griffin. He apparently had a whole ton more fights, possibly 100 or more fights beyond what we have on his record today from what he had said. And same with one of Langford's first elite opponents, Jack Blackburn, later coached to great Joe Louis and other top fighters. But Jack Blackburn had, maybe 100, 200 more fights than what we have for his record. A lot of this stuff's happening in private, or it's happening in a small thing where the newspapers don't even know about it. A lot of times in the papers, I'll even see like a night of fights listed. They'll name the main fight, and then they'll just say, and the preliminaries should be good with local lads. So we don't actually have, so we can't, if you go to BoxRec, it's a great site. You will see opponent records and things like that. It's very useful. But when we go this far back in the past, we're missing some things. So we're what we're doing here is going through these years, sort of describe the shape of their career. We're not trying to give a definitive day by day account of their lives, especially as we're on a certain time constraint, even splitting this into 3 or more shows. So that brings us up through Johnson's 02. He's had some tough fights with Everett and with Hank Griffin, and he's lost to choice, but he's gotten this great mentoring for the nearly month that they were in jail together. So he's come out, he's now got like the new, more polished skills. Johnson's level of competition has gone up. So I want to jump over to 1902 Sam Langford. It won't take very long. He only had 4 fights that we know about, and I think there was maybe 2 or 3 other bookings that never happened. But he had 3 amateur fights. He fought twice in a night, 2 wins. The second of which is against Jack McVicker, who will fight 2 more times. And interestingly, the Boston Post and the other Boston paper, what's called the Globe, disagreed on who won the Roanoke tournament, amateur tournament. One of them thought McVicker made him look foolish. The other one thought Langford did the leading and did the correct work. So you'll see even then, back then, sources on the ground, they don't always agree and what happened, it depends what someone's looking for. We'll see that in Johnson's career later when he fights Marvin Hart. Like how you approach a fight, depending on who's calling it, whether it's a ref or judges and who they are, their own temperament, you can get different results depending on how you fight. Johnson, maybe that hurt him sometimes in his career when he was in a safer mode. Same with Jack Blackburn. Sometimes being a come forward fighter, that volume, the punches, they say the judges see the ones you throw better than the ones you land. And maybe more modern fighters like Joe Calzaghe, where he's throwing so much. Yeah, they're not all flush punches, but look at the volume. When you're outstriking a guy 2 or 3 to 1, it's hard to make up for it with some hard shots if there's no knockdown. But anyway, Langford's 0-2. Yeah, so if I can't remember his first opponent's amateur name, but it's at the Roanoke Club, highly esteemed amateur club that put on tournaments. And I think Barbados Walcott, the great Joe Walcott, who Langford later fights in 04, he won a tournament at the Roanoke. I'd seen that mentioned in an article promoting one of their, I think 1903 or 1904 planned, I think it was 03 scheduled night of fights they were predicting. But Langford wins that. Then he gets booked again against McVicker, and he gets the best of him. This time I just see the one version where he got the best. And then he turns pro again against McVicker. This gets him banned by the athletic union, the amateur athletic union. So now he's a full pro. And this time I believe he stops McVicker in 5 of 6 rounds. So he gets a finish, gets his first career finish. That ends Langford's 0-2. He had a couple other fights, Kid Ringgold, a couple other guys he was booked against that didn't happen. Apparently, according to Clay Moyle's book, Langford went up to New Hampshire. He went back doing more logging work. And then when it got cold in New Hampshire, he realized he didn't like that at all. Remembered why he came to Boston in the first place. And because Langford was from Nova Scotia, he'd worked his way down as a teenager, ending up in Boston through various things I won't get into. But yeah, so he took the break, and then he comes back in January of 03. Now, perhaps, Josh, I'll let you go ahead and talk about Johnson's 03. But what I do want to bring up is, like, just to address something, because I see people say they act like there's some revisionist history going on when we talk about the Colored World Championship. And so I just want to throw this up. This is one of the main newspapers in the U.S. because Boston was such a heavy-duty scene. This is, I believe, the Boston Post, one of the definitive reporting agencies in the United States at a time when boxing was a huge deal in Boston. So many of the top fighters had fought or were training other people out of here. But in 1902, Frank Ernie, the lightweights lowered his colors to Joe Gans. That's significant because Langford will actually fight and defeat Joe Gans at the end of 1903 season. And then Frank Childs passed the colored heavyweight title to Denver Ed Martin. So just to put it up there, definitively get it out of the way, because people troll with that and say these weren't real things. These were real things, but they weren't always reported depending on the author and the context of the article. But if you look at the people who were most intimately involved in it, who didn't have a side agenda, yes, it's a real thing. It means the purse is bigger. Sometimes there are claims, sometimes it's more of a defined thing. Oftentimes these things are sorted out. As Josh mentioned, with Childs and Klondike and all of this, Denver Ed and later Johnson and other guys. Like, these things are sorted out. These guys end up fighting each other. So the claims dwindle down, just as happened in other generations. The claims dwindle down until it's not just all these separate claims. They've actually sorted out who the best is. So titles are complicated. This isn't a science. This is more like, we mentioned this, Josh, talking the other night. There have been so many sanctioning bodies over the years. We're not talking about one defined thing that's always had a definite structure. We're talking about, a lot of times, especially going this far back, we're talking about claims that get sorted out when they fight each other, depending on the results. And sometimes if you beat a guy on points and someone else finishes him, there's still a claim on, and then you have to fight now. And the athletic clubs, who were innumerable in this time, would put up the money to settle those claims in front of their patrons. So, okay, so I've addressed the colored heavyweight title, which Johnson will later win. Would you like to talk about this year during which he wins this in his 1903 season, Josh?
Yep. Just before that, of course, mentioning just in 1902, of course, he did.
Oh, my apologies, brother. I skipped over his 1902. Go ahead and do his 02 and 03.
Well, you mentioned 1902, so you did mention some of the stuff. Of course, he was in with Hank Griffin again in 1902, but I just wanted to touch on some other significant fights at the time. Joe Kennedy, he was a contender of the time. Fought some top level guys. If you check out his resume, you'll see he was in with some counterparts that and names that will look familiar, of course. Jack Jeffries in 1902, he took on the May, defeating him. Was actually the brother of Jim Jeffries, world heavyweight champion at the time, Jim Jeffries, and Johnson was able to defeat him. But Jack Jeffries, of course, didn't have that same type of prestige as a fighter as, of course, Jim. Uh, he would knock out Klondike Haynes again. So at this point, Klondike Haynes was no match for Johnson for the most part. He'd had two draws with Hank Griffin, who I mentioned was a tough fighter who had been in with a lot of the top level guys in or around heavyweight at that particular time. Uh, and then the 1902 on October 21st, I think that was significant. He beat Frank Childs, a multi-time colored heavyweight champion who at the time had essentially a claim to the colored world title. That's what Brandon was mentioning, how there's sometimes claims out there. But this, of course, was counteracted by Denver Ed Martin, who he had fought with, and I believe he had lost, and that is the reason that this claim wasn't fully substantiated. Uh, and then, of course, Jack Johnson in 1902 would fight George Gardner of light heavyweight fame, really, but a solid boxer from the time. Had a brother who was top level as well. The name escapes me. And then Fred Russell, he's one of those big guys who at the time was he didn't have a ton of fights, but he, much like some others I mentioned, like Mexican Pete Everett, um, Joe Kennedy, he like them in the amount of fights that he had, put in a lot of work against a lot of top level competition. So these guys usually had a number of losses, but that can be expected because when you look at how things ended up working out, a lot of the guys that they lost to eventually became some of the best fighters in history in the heavyweight division and sometimes beyond, as a matter of fact. But then we can jump into 1903. So the significance of 1903, of course, is there would be no question of that of who was the colored world heavyweight champion because he would open up 1903 with a win over the tough and rugged Denver Ed Martin. He's a fighter who was 6'3". He had only one loss at the time of coming into that fight, and that loss might have been to Frank Childs, if I'm not mistaken, or it could have been him or Bob Armstrong. I don't know off top, but essentially Denver Ed Martin, he was a tough, rugged guy, rugged heavyweight from the time, and he's another one who probably in totality his fight career might have been around 40 fights or just shy of that, but it was all tough fights for the most part from the jump. So he would lose to Jack Johnson, and this is where essentially the world colored heavyweight title came into Johnson's hand, and he started his reign. And this would be a reign that would ultimately be the third longest reign as the colored world heavyweight champion. So, and that's because he would hold on to it, of course, until he actually won the world heavyweight title, which we'll get to at some point. But this shows just the trajectory that Johnson was on. So by this time, while he started out slow, just trying to make a name for himself, by this time, it was known, and Jack Johnson was already being considered to be the best black heavyweight out there at this particular time, just based on what people knew of him and what people had seen at that particular time. And so in his very next fight, he would take on Sam McVeigh. Now this would be the seventh fight of Sam McVeigh, and he would hand Sam McVeigh his first loss of his career and defend, his claim to the colored world heavyweight title. Now McVeigh, of course, was young. He was green at this particular time. Johnson wasn't, and it's not that Johnson wasn't a younger fighter at the time. He had a little bit more experience than Sam McVay at that particular point. But Sam McVay, who I have a video on out there right now, he would certainly learn from what would become a mini rivalry with Jack Johnson. And I think this proved to be beneficial. Having the opportunity to fight him this early on, proved to be beneficial for him later in his career. But Johnson would beat Sam McVay, and I think Johnson just had a little bit more craftiness, a little bit more polishedness, or he was a little bit more polished than Sam McVay at that particular time. But Sam McVay, of course, as we know, was one of the strong fighters, could be considered a knockout artist of his time for sure. And he followed that up with the win over Big Sandy Ferguson, another one of those guys who I mentioned. The name probably doesn't stand out much. And this took place in Boston, but he was able to get a 10-round points victory over Sandy Ferguson, who was a strong fighter, a big guy who had, of course, over the course of his career, much like any heavyweight who was able to get their name elevated to some level, been in with a lot of the top guys who at that same time were all on that same trajectory, that same path of trying to get to an actual world title. He also in 1903 fought a guy by the name of Joe Butler. Now, Joe Butler, he isn't a name that will stand out for many because he probably didn't have that prominence from a popularity standpoint. But if you check out Joe Butler, he was a solid all-around fighter. He was a strong fighter as well, but he competed with many of the top heavyweights and beyond at the time, and he was competing for the colored world heavyweight title, and he never won it, but he's one of those guys who had a ton of fights, a ton of experience, and it's the type of experience that as a younger fighter, of course, you can benefit from. And I think that this in turn was another one, and Jack Johnson was able to stop Joe Butler, and that I think that speaks volumes. If you look up Joe Butler and the type of competition that he was in with, then you'll gain that understanding of why that was the case. And of course, Johnson would again beat Sandy Ferguson. He would rematch Sam McVay in 1903 as well, winning a 20-round decision. Of course, as mentioned, Sam McVay still kind of learning on the job as he goes on. Same can be said for Jack Johnson, but at this particular time, we've seen that his trajectory and as far as his competition has just essentially continued to rise, and that's the reason that he's now pretty much in his groove. And he would go on to defeat Sandy Ferguson again, and he had a no decision with Sandy Ferguson that was viewed as a win by some, but he would also take on Black Bill. This is a guy who was another fighter from the time who, while he's not prominent in terms of the names that you remember in just the history of boxing in itself, during his time, he was a formidable fighter, a very experienced fighter. And Black Bill, of course, is another name that Jack Johnson was able to add to the notch on his belt. And Black Bill had been in with some other top level fighters from that time, especially a lot of the black fighters from that time. And this proved to be a benefit to Johnson as he continued on through 1904 for taking on Sam McVay, Frank Charles, and Denver Ed Barton again. So it just shows that it didn't slow down as far as the competition level for Jack Johnson as he was just ironing out that first portion of his career. And having the colored world heavyweight title that only attracted more who wanted to take that spot because they wanted the money that comes with being considered the champion. And of course, the ultimate prize that everyone wanted to get to was the world heavyweight title. And best believe that if you had the colored world heavyweight title at that particular time, then there were those who were going to be calling and seeking a fight between you and whomever had the world heavyweight title, the establishment title at that particular time as well. And we saw that. And so by the time that as we get on, as we move forward, once we get more into these discussions, of course, by the time that Johnson got to that point where he actually was able to compete for the world heavyweight title, it was considered long overdue. And a lot of that is because they could look back on his career where he started, then the fighters who he competed with, and know that in all likelihood, the time for him had already come, and he likely would have been trouble for whomever the champion was in those years prior. But you can only fight the fight that you can get, and of course, you can only take advantage of that title shot when that title shot presents itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Great recap there of those years, Josh. So moving over to young Sam Langford. His the main thing to know about Langford is he was tough as nails. He had gotten in, according to his own accounts, when he was young, when he was out, he was keeping himself handy with his fists in his teens, as he's in these rough environments, and when at a time when fighting for entertainment or a little bet or both, that you could stage that anywhere. So I think like almost like a pickup soccer match or some basketball. Let's have a quick fight. This was a pretty rough time, and the toughest, the hardest characters in this time are incredibly rough fellows and durable compared to today, the way we're used to living today. There's a lot of technology we take for granted that did not exist. There weren't even words for it in around the turn of the century. So it's a completely different world. Langford's so we don't know much compared to what we could, but from the accounts that have been found, here's Langford's 1902 and his at least 28 fights in 1903. I'm not going to go through every fight. I'll just say that apparently he had been living in and been the janitor for the Lenox Athletic Club, one of the basically the promotions / fight houses camps in Boston, one of the main ones. So he had lots of fights. The Lenox, you'll see there on the list. He was living in Cambridge. Once he got his own place, I think he moved out to Cambridge, but I believe the Lenox was in Boston itself. He wasn't making huge money on any given fight, but when you see how many fights he had, and imagine that he probably had more fights than this. I mean, the guy was just out at the fights. There were times when he had stepped in one of these fights. I think I'm trying to remember who was supposed to be fighting. Someone was supposed to be fighting Jack Blackburn, and he stepped in that night. Like he stepped in on short notice, just had the fight. So Langford was incredibly busy. He was already known to be clever. Like I've seen in reports where he had a clever left hand. He had a good jab and he had good defensive skills. And he wasn't necessarily known at first for his power, but his gameness and his lead hand, very educated lead hand. But Langford wasn't floating around. Yes, he was in the Lenox, but he also had some very specific high-level help. Let me see if I have my graphic here. Here we go. So on the left there is George Byers, fellow Canadian, former middle and heavyweight colored champion himself. He was helping Langford, especially Langford said he taught him how to set his weight and snap the left hook. Langford later, his left hook would be arguably his best punch. He certainly finished a lot of fights with it. And then top center there is Jimmy Walsh, a bantamweight, also out of the Lenox. He was actually living in Newton, Massachusetts, which is out west of the city of Boston, one of the suburbs. But he, believe, fought out of the Lenox, and he was helping Langford. And they trained. These three were together for many years. And later on, Bob Armstrong, another former colored heavyweight champion, he joined them and was also helping train Langford. But George Byers, right there, he should probably get the principal credit. Him and Jimmy Walsh. get the principal credit for teaching Langford the craft. And then obviously once Langford was off to the races, I mean, and he had the opportunity because he's based out of a club. So he had multiple fights. I'm not even sure how many, but he had a bunch of fights just out of the Lennox Club that year. But he's also fighting everywhere else. Fighting in Cambridge. He goes down to Situate, Rhode Island. In his first year, he fights 20 rounds against Belfield Walcott. Belfield Walcott, very good lightweight, who fought himself at a high level. Let me pull this graphic back up. This was just a couple weeks after his first points loss of his career. He lost to Danny Duane, a New York area lightweight, a volume fighter. Duane was a good fighter, didn't fight much longer after this. Apparently, according to Clay Moyle's book, a young fighter died, and then Duane and his friend decided to stop boxing. But Duane was a very good fighter. He was prominent in the lightweight circles. But just 2 weeks later, Langford had his first 20-round bout. So even though he's gaining experience, it's not all short fights. Some of these are longer fights. And some of the repeat customers there, like early in the year, Luther Manuel, well, the first fight they had was excellent. So they booked it again, and they had another fantastic fight. And then they booked it again. The first one was at the Essex AC, and then the Lennox, where Langford's based, they made the fight. And then the Essex made a third one between them. And I think that was a 10-rounder. So, 4, 6, and 10. So you see, like, at this time, the athletic clubs, they were very carefully weeding through all the local talent that would debut each year and pitting them against each other. So a lot of these opponents here, they may not be from the class of 02, but they may be in that realm. And then some veterans toward the end of the year, he starts fighting more experienced fighters. I should say mid-year, because Andy Watson was a big step up. But like, say, Johnny Johnson there, about a quarter of the way down that list. Johnson he won the amateur tournament at the Roanoke Club the same night Langford won. Langford won at 135. Johnny Johnson won at 145. And so they fought to a draw. I don't know if it was a prearranged draw or what. And some of these fights, they come together very quickly. This was true even generations later, but they'll be waiting backstage with the contract. But these fights, all these different clubs, and Langford was just taking everything. He just took everything that anyone could give him. So we know about 28 now. It was 27 until, a month or two ago. Now we know there's at least 28, plus who knows how many others. But this 1903, he starts to get steps up. So he had a rivalry with Andy Watson. Who was the best of that part of the city. And then Timmy Kearns had been a big draw in the Boston area, and he came back. He was trying to make his comeback. Langford got him out of there very quickly and keeps fighting Watson. So I'm going to skip through because I just don't want to go through fight by fight because it'll take too long. But then he has the 20 rounds. He bounces back from the Duane loss. There was apparently a side bet of $500 between his manager and the backer of Duane, the backers. And so he lost the side bet. Then he fights 20 rounds against Belfield Walcott, fights Kid Griffo. Kid Griffo had a couple good wins in his career, but also fought some, pretty tough fights against the best of the area. Shadow Morris, Arthur Cote, Patsy Sweeney was up in New Hampshire. That was a good fight, and he got him out of there in the 12th, but he came through the fire to win that fight. And Sweeney was a very offensive fighter when he did show up, and literally and figuratively, apparently Sweeney didn't come through on a couple bookings to where I saw in the newspaper. They were like, blacklist this guy till he gets his stuff together. But anyway, he did show up for this one, put on a great fight, but he did ultimately lose. Langford stopped him. Then Langford beat one of the Joe Reeds. I think there were at least 2 Joe Reeds in the scene at this time. He beat Joe Reed, and I think that was a DQ. He was beating on him so bad that Joe Reed turned to wrestling and started doing trips and throws and got himself DQ'd in the 4th. But and then Langford fights the great Joe Gans, one of the premier stylists of all time, but certainly of this era. This was the premier lightweight talent. As I mentioned earlier, he took the title from Frank Ernie in 01, but Joe Gans was fighting a pretty crazy schedule himself. So this was a lot of fights later. And Jack Blackburn had gotten a little bit the best of him over 6 rounds a few weeks before this. And Joe Gans was so busy, he fought Dave Hawley, a premier lightweight that / welter that Langford will encounter next year. And the night before he fought Langford, he had 6 tough rounds. Then he took the train. He was drinking, I guess, or whatever, playing cards. Then he fought Langford, and he took Langford lightly. He got beat quite convincingly over 15 rounds, especially the last 7 or 8 rounds. But then Langford goes in, and he has a prearranged draw with the great Jack Blackburn, but Blackburn gets the best of him. There are differing reports on how much Blackburn got the best of him, but he certainly would have deserved this decision over the 12 rounds if they had given a decision. But Langford's people had insisted on a prearranged draw, meaning split the money right down the middle if both guys finish the fight on their feet. So as far as like his highest level work, Langford's gone all the way from like easier fights, like say Billy Jordan, about halfway down that list. He got shot 3 times in the abdomen a year earlier, came back. This was, I think, one of his last couple fights on his attempted comeback. So that you could say that was an easier fight. Then he's fought one of the greatest of all time, Joe Gans. In my book, the greatest lightweight of all time, but in most books, he's at least a top 3, along with Benny Leonard and the great Roberto Duran. So Langford's first full season, one of the great seasons. It's not packed with names like some of his later years, but it's packed with activity, and it shows how game he was. So now, Josh, I'm going to throw it back to you. You got into 1904, I suppose, didn't you? For Johnson, you touched on 1904. Yep. So I guess we can say at the end of this year, Langford is now the New England champion. He would have been the lightweight world champion had he not come in 2 pounds over the agreed weight. So lightweight was 133, but they didn't do like rehydration clauses necessarily in this day. What they would do is ringside weigh-ins. So he had to be 138 to fight for the 133 pounds title. He had to be 138 ringside. He came in at 140, so he didn't get the title. But Gans did fight welterweights. Just that Langford was so dangerous, that when they were supposed to rematch the next year, Gans insisted again, 138 ringside. He wouldn't fight him. And he actually, the aforementioned Kid Griffo, ended up getting that booking. Langford was going to fight him in 04. They were going to rematch for the title. Langford indicated he wouldn't make weight, and Gans switched the booking and fought Kid Griffo in a challenge match. $100 a round if you last past 10 rounds, and if you go the distance, you can take my purse. And I think there was a side bet involved too. Gans was big on the side bets. But anyway, so that's 1903. That's a very brief touch on Langford's 1903. I will go through 1904. This is a crazy year. So he has another fight with his old rival, Andy Watson. Draws with Jack Blackburn in Philly. There's a no decision state in Pennsylvania. So, if it goes a distance, there's no official decision. But according to the average of the newspaper accounts that were on the scene, that was a draw. They split honors. Then fights Belfield Walcott again. Belfield Walcott, the brother of the great Barbados Joe Walcott, the terrifying welterweight champion, multi-weight fighter of this time. Then he has looks like an exhibition, according to Cyber, with Charlie Johnson. Then stops Willie Lewis, who would go on to quite a lot of success, would actually roll around with the same management as, I believe, Sam McVeigh. I think Willie Lewis was in McVeigh's camp when he went over to Paris. I'm quite sure. I'm fairly sure, at least. Then Langford picks up another loss to Dave Hawley, the very tricky sort of, he do a shoulder roll, he could fight out of a crouch, he could fight coming forward two-handed. But Dave Hawley was described anywhere from clever to erratic. And he had some mixed results, but he fought a tremendous schedule himself. He had a bunch of fights this year, and actually gets the best of Langford, kind of fools him with the shoulder roll and the crouching attack, and Langford learned from that, though. They would fight again. That would be Hawley's one win against him. Then he goes in. This was the next fight with George Elbows McFadden, who was a very clever defensive boxer, had some good wins in his career, very good wins, and also some high-level losses. And he was actually scheduled to fight McFadden the year before in 03, but it didn't happen. When they did finally meet in 04, he stops him in 2. He then goes in for his only actual, undisputed world title shot against the great Barbados Joe Walcott. Fights him up in New Hampshire, 15 rounds. He gets the best of it in most of the rounds, but the ref calls it a draw based on a strong showing from Walcott toward the end of the fight. And that was something this time, it's the ref's decision, so it wasn't a panel of judges. He didn't even have to score it by the rounds. But Langford did get the best of that fight, got the best of another all-time great fighter. So now he's, if you talk about great stylists of the early era, Joe Gans and Barbados Walcott are 2 of the top 5, probably. You could certainly make that argument, especially for Gans, but Walcott was a terror. Then goes back in, 2 more fights with Dave Hawley, draws over 15 rounds, and then draws in Philly over 6 rounds. Then he gets a win over Andy Watson. Langford's growing at this point. By the end of 04, he's a welterweight now, so Watson's sort of like more of a lightweight a viable lightweight. So he gets the best of him. He then gets the best of Tommy Sullivan, draws again with the great Jack Blackburn, and then Joe Reed. I think this might be a different Joe Reed than the Panic Wrestling Joe Reed, but he stops this guy in 9. So that gets us through Langford's 1904. This is a lot, folks. You know, hopefully we'll get through these next, before I have to call it, we'll get through these next 2 seasons, including their fight. But just going to keep plowing forward. This is why we talk about these guys like these are all-time greats, because even the bits of their career we do know about is just incredibly epic. And that brings us up to 1905, right, Josh? This was an important year for
Right.
heavyweight boxing because Jim Jeffries had his last fight for what would be several years, well, many years in '04. And we had Jack Root and Marvin Hart fight for the vacant title. And this, would you like to talk? I'll pull up Johnson's '05. I'll just go right on into it, brother.
Right. So it just so happens that Johnson would open up '05 against the aforementioned Marvin Hart, former world heavyweight champion. And while it looks and is listed and in some cases reported as a loss over 20 rounds, looking at reports from the time, this would be what we consider a robbery, as Johnson was the better fighter. Holistically, Hart did nothing to be able to show that he was better than Jack Johnson at that particular time, but it was up to the referee, who had the lone decision, and he gave it to Hart. And reports indicate that the referee said he did so based on Hart's aggressiveness. But in all actuality, if you look at the reporting and the coverage at that time, you'll see that everyone pretty much knew that it was Jack Johnson who deserved the nod in that particular fight. And of course, the rest was history for Marvin Hart, who had I guess you can say, short stint as the world heavyweight champion, though in most cases it's not really uh, mentioned or remembered like that. It's because of the fact that it wasn't anything that was illustrious, I guess you can say, compared to some of the other reigns that we have. And as we know, over the years, there have been those reigns that kind of get looked over, glossed over, don't stand out above the competition, and that is one of them. But of course, that wouldn't stop Jack Johnson for continuing to make his name, establish himself as arguably the best heavyweight in the world at that particular time, because he would continue to fight. He get a win over the well-traveled Jim Jeffords. He's another one of those contenders from the time who had a lot of names on his resume that he was in with, a lot of varying styles competing with them. Johnson was able to knock out Jim Jeffords. And if you look at a number of the top fighters from that time, you'll likely run across Jim Jeffords' name in there with some of them at some point. And he would follow that up with a victory over Black Bill. Mind you, this should have been a continual streak that dated back to 1901, but because of that Marvin Hart robbery, that he didn't get the luxury of that. But he picked up a knockout victory, a TKO victory over Black Bill, whom he had previously defeated before going in with a rising heavyweight at the time, who had, I guess you can say, a slow start, coming in at 0-3, and that's the great Joe Jeanette. And Joe Jeanette, we could make a video just on his career alone. We know that he was one of the standout heavyweights of the era, or he would become such as time went on. And this was very early in his career, though though Jeanette was green at the time. He showed a lot of promise, and Joe Jeanette would actually continue on to be the heavyweight that Jack Johnson himself deemed to have given him the most trouble. And I think that's just giving the tool set that Joe Jeanette possessed. He was a great all around fighter. He just had a mix of everything that you needed and the real shape of what was needed to be a top heavyweight at the time. He had a cleverness to him that allowed for him to be able to compete at a high level, regardless of who he was in with. And this was a very green Joe Jeanette, mind you. So that speaks volumes in itself. And Johnson would pick up that victory. Of course, no easy routes there. And he would go on to defeat the likes of Jack Monroe, heavyweight from the time, who was a solid guy who, much like many of them, fought who was available, where he could get the most money. And Jack Monroe, he has a lot of top level names on his resume. He had a very short career in terms of total fights, but he did a lot in terms of names in those total fights. So you will notice that he was in with a number of top guys, but he had a total of around 17 fights that we know of at the very least. But he made the best of them. And so Johnson, he would continue on, and he would take on pretty much anyone. As mentioned, he would take on the likes of Morris Harris, who was another black fighter from the time, who was one of those guys who wasn't a huge name that we remember, but just well traveled. And what I mean by that is these are guys who would pick up and go and fight anywhere at any time, or you could just throw them in the mix with anyone, anywhere at any time, and they'd be able to handle themselves. So Harris was in with a lot of top names. We're talking Sam Langford, George Gardner, Joe Jeanette, etc., Al Kubiak, just a lot of the top guys, top heavyweights for sure, from that era. And so Johnson was able to stop him. And now it's noted that uh, Johnson had actually fought Black Bill on his same day as well. So these were kind of 2-3 round fights that were something. I mean, we don't see it today, of course, but at the time it was something that could happen. But uh, that, I guess, speaks something. Even though it was 3 rounders, yeah, same day or same night, essentially. Black Bill and Morris Harris for Johnson there, which would have been July 13th, 1905. And then he would follow that up with the victory over Sandy Ferguson. This was via DQ. But still, Sandy Ferguson, this was one of, I think it was probably like the fourth or fifth time he beat Sandy Ferguson. And in July of 1905, on the 24th, he would take on Iron Man Joe Grimm. Now, Joe Grimm, of course, if you've heard of him, is one of those guys whose record is not glamorous. He lost more than he won, but he was in a crazy amount of fights. It's like something you wouldn't see today for sure. Nearly 200 fights, and a lot of these were no decision bouts that he actually competed in. So if you look at his record, and depending on the site that you look at and how they track things, like BoxRec, for instance, doesn't necessarily account for the no decisions in the same manner as Cyber Boxing Zone or one of the other record keeping type sites that is out there. But Joe Grimm on BoxRec, you'll see that it says he won 17 fights, but as mentioned, the newspaper decision being the difference. But Joe Grimm was, man, he was in with everyone. He was known to be a tough fighter and had a lot of fanfare because of his ability to take punishment. It's like some outer worldly type ability to take punishment, based on what I've gathered from reading up on him at the time. But this was a win for Johnson. He got a 6-round victory over him, and it wasn't close from all indications. And Johnson would go back in with the great Joe Jeanette. And as mentioned, Joe Jeanette, one of the top heavyweights in the history of the sport, not just during that time, but he transcended history just in general. This ultimately did not go very long. It was intended for 6 rounds, but it would be a disqualification loss for Johnson in the second round of this contest. I believe it was due to a low shot. And of course, that wouldn't be the end of those two because Joe Jeanette ended up being, I guess, what you can consider Johnson's greatest rival. When you think about the likes of, we usually lump together Sam McVeigh, Jack Johnson, Sam Langford, and Joe Jeanette, and each of them had their own sort of internal rivalries or whatever. For Jack Johnson, the greatest rival for him was, without a doubt, Joe Jeanette. And I think, as I had mentioned previously, when you're competing with these type of guys, especially for multiple fights, then you're learning, you're giving, and you're taking, and that prepares you for when you step in with other fighters, especially if they aren't up to the caliber of the opponents that you're used to facing. So Johnson would then move into a fight with an experienced, at the time, smaller but very game top level fighter from the time, young Peter Jackson, who took his namesake from the Black Prince Peter Jackson. But essentially, young Peter Jackson, well traveled fighter at the time, and he was able to, or Johnson was able to pick up a 12-round points victory over him. Now Johnson is a bigger fighter by comparison to young Peter Jackson, as a matter of fact, but it didn't matter to Jackson, as he was routinely in with a lot of bigger fighters. He actually competed at lower weights as well, and he would have been giving up, of course, height and pounds, but it was the norm for him. Um, Johnson, of course, this was a good win on paper, given the fact that Peter Jackson at the time had well over 100 fights. But of course, Johnson was a bigger fighter, so he did what he needed to do to get the victory. But Jackson, of course, he gave Johnson a very tough fight, even though he was a smaller guy, but he was just game in that sense. So there was always an expectation anytime you stepped in with young Peter Jackson that you were going to be in for a game tough fighter who could withstand a lot of punishment, and he could dish it out as well. And then there, towards the end of 1905, it would be Johnson taking on, as mentioned, his greatest rival in a 6-round decision, Joe Jeanette. Johnson would pick up this decision over Jeanette, and this would be sort of a start to Johnson just continually building that name, or this would be a continuation of such, and this would help him start to get that clamoring and the chance and wants and needs for him to face whomever was the champion at that time. And by 1905, it can't remember, it may have been Burns at this particular point, but you would start to hear those chants and get that clamoring, because it was very obvious that Johnson was pretty much the best heavyweight in the world at this point, just given what we were able to see from him and competing with the other guys who were considered to be in that running at the time. So it was all a matter of time at that point. And as we know, the time would eventually come, but of course, still some tough battles to try and get to before he got there. And that pretty much sums up his 1905.
Nicely done there, Josh City. So here's a graphic I made. This counts 06, but I think all of these he'd met them by 05. So there's upper left, there's Hank Griffin, left to right, Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, Denver Ed Martin, Black Bill, Marvin Hart. Bottom row, left to right, Frank Charles, Klondike Haynes, Big Sandy Ferguson, George Gardner, and his brothers were Billy, and I think might have been Mike, but there were 3 brothers out of, I believe, Lowell, Massachusetts, one of the industrial towns up north of the city, up north of Boston, I should say. The Gardner brothers, yeah, very famous in the region at that time. Like I said, the Boston area was one of the premier areas there was bigger money in California, but it was one of the premier places for fights to happen, especially in the lead up to, say, like 1904. Things changed a little bit in Boston itself in 1904, but leading up to that, it was a huge place, and then the region stayed relevant. Yeah, and then Joe Choinsky, and there's young Peter Jackson. Young Peter Jackson was a clinch specialist. Part of the reason I think he might have been able to, like, he wasn't. I've seen reports where he said he wasn't that popular of a fighter because he did know how to slow fights down. So think of him as like a Bernard Hopkins when he was in the mood type fighter. Very, very good, but maybe not the most exciting. Part of the reason Langford became so popular was he would walk guys straight down, even in a square stance. You know, he had the artillery in the chin to have a tear up or have a more scientific bout. You know, he could fight both ways. So, but yeah, young Peter Jackson, a common opponent of the two. So I'm going to touch on Langford's 1905. We've got about 30 minutes left for this particular episode. So let's see what we get to. Let me pull this up. This photo of Langford on the right there is from a little bit later in his career. That's not a 1905 picture. Although in the previous seasons, this one right here I saw in the paper in 1903. So that's either 1902 or a 1903 photo. And this one here is 1903. He looks a little bit older in that one than the earlier picture. So that's probably taken around the time of the Gans fight. So anyway, 1905, Langford's schedule is still crazy. He finishes one of the possibly two Joe Reids. Then he fights the Australian George Gunther, Belfield Walcott again, Dave Holly again. This time he gets the best of Dave Holly. Then he goes in with George Cole. The fights, the refereeing, especially for colored fighters, was a little bit harsh. If you weren't having a tear up, they might stop the fight and not pay you, or sometimes people even be banned from fighting in a city. They think they even suspected there was either arrangement or just guys not putting their all into it. And the standard's pretty high for colored fighters at this time for a variety of reasons. So the fight with George Cole, he did meet Cole in the ring, but stopped in 9, no contest. Then he goes back in with George Gunther, gets him on points, will guard his hide. Then he fights young Peter Jackson, Sim Tompkins, and gets the best of him over 15 rounds in May, and then again in June he gets the best of him. The first one in Marlborough, Massachusetts, the second time in Chelsea, Mass. Chelsea is where the year following Langford would fight Jack Johnson. And if I'm not mistaken, well, I know that Langford fought on the undercard of one of Johnson's 1903 fights with Big Sandy Ferguson, and I think that might have been in Chelsea as well. I can't remember who Langford fought, but I think that was actually also in Chelsea, Massachusetts. But anyway, so then he goes in with Larry Temple, who was protege of manager Tom O'Rourke. O'Rourke had a falling out with the great Barbados Walcott, who had been his protege, and Larry Temple was supposedly going to be the answer to that. He did fight Walcott for the world title. They had some fights, but Larry Temple gets the best of Langford over 10 rounds in Marlborough. He then goes in, he gets the best of the great Jack Blackburn, and this time he gets a win. That's a 15-round fight, and that's in Leaperville, PA. Then he draws with Temple over 15, draws with Blackburn over 10, draws with young Peter Jackson over 15 in Marlborough, Allentown, PA, and Baltimore, respectively. And then some sort of no contest in Philly. This might have been another fight that was stopped for inactivity, or the ref suspected an arrangement, or like an agreement to not go all out, or whatever it was. But I'm pretty sure that one's the ref stopped that fight. That's why it's no contest. Then at the end of the year, he fights the great Joe Jeanette. Joe Jeanette wasn't at his full size at this point. He was a young man, but Langford was even smaller and was certainly not had hit his full physicality, even though Langford already had fantastic wins in this time, you know, and including like with Barbados Walcott, where he did get the best of him, but he didn't get the official verdict. But by all accounts, he got the best of the fight. There was no question in that in anyone's mind, including the ref, who just said, yeah, but he made up for it at the end. But there was no question. So Langford's body of work already by the end of 05 is ridiculous. Now, Jack Johnson, you can see his work is like guys in the light heavy to heavyweight range. He had a lot of experience. And then also like lighter fighter like Jackson, and then later like Langford himself. But Johnson might have been fighting guys a little bit bigger and smaller than him. Langford was already giving up significant weight. He was partly because he was being avoided by some of the top fighters, so he just kept on moving up. And like we said, he was a real hard man. So, and you know, one of his trainers, George Byers, was a middleweight, but he won the colored heavyweight championship at one point. So as far as like weight traveling, Byers very clever, a clever middleweight, but he was someone who could compete above his own size at times. So Langford had examples of that. And Langford's hero, according to him, in his 1924 sort of memoir piece, syndicated piece in the newspaper, I think the Halifax Herald was the main paper it was for. He said his hero, Langford said his hero was Bob Fitzsimmons, and so another weight traveling legend. So, and Langford later praised Barbados Walcott, who was another great weight traveler, as his toughest fight. He said he never hit anyone more or got hit more than in that fight with Barbados Walcott. So, as you mentioned, Josh, Walcott was hugely respected in his day. Johnson, I think you mentioned that in the show and not off air, but Johnson praised him to no end. Langford praised him, many greats. So guys like Joe Gans, Barbados Walcott, Langford, and Johnson themselves, when they're celebrated throughout the generations, we can learn from that. There's a reason for it because it was very hard to become celebrated. You could have some great wins, or even after Langford beat Joe Gans, there were still questions about him. But before I throw it back to you for to maybe touch on the lead up to their '06 fight, or maybe I'm not sure. Maybe we've gone far enough for today's show as far as in chronologically. But here's some of Langford's significant opponents. This is leading up to um, and including, I believe, '06. But top left there, Jack Blackburn, then Joe Gans, Elbows McFadden, Dave Hawley, the loop puncher Dave Hawley, then Larry Temple, Willie Lewis, Danny Dwayne. Danny Dwayne, of course, got the best of him, and as had Dave Hawley in their first meeting and Larry Temple in their first meeting. But Langford could improve on his results. I mean, it was like you said, Josh. You fight at a high level to get to a high level. That's what made Joe Jeanette so great. He very quickly was fighting world class heavyweights, and so regardless of what he started off like 10-10 with some draws, but you look at who he was fighting, and it explains a lot. He could have just filled that with tomato cans, with winnable fights, but he went in there, and that's where the money was tough fights. Langford did this too. So they're both Walcott brothers there. On the right of the two, Belfield wasn't the match of his brother, but he had learned from his brother, and he was a high-level lightweight. Barbados Walcott on the left there was an absolute terror, and the Barbados Wonder. But later, it's racially charged time, so they call him like the Black Demon of Barbados or some variant on that. So you see that with Langford too. Like some of his nicknames are a little bit unsavory in the context of today, and then others translate across, like the Boston Bone Crusher. Well, everyone getting the Boston Terror, but that translates. But the Black Demon in Boston, the Tar Baby, that's So on this channel, at least, I try to be sort of somewhat sensitive and not just berate people with the overt racism of the time in the reporting. We're trying to look past that at the sport, as I know you do yourself, Josh. We have to deal with the reality, but we don't have to just drench the content in things that stir up something ugly, because we are talking about competition, and the hardcore fans wanted the best fight the best. The racial politics were between the fighters and sometimes the wider public, but the promoters and the fans wanted the best fight the best, regardless of who they were. And so there was a lot of pressure. Some of these fights that didn't happen, including the rematch with Johnson Langford, the point of the series, or at least one of the main points of the series. There was a lot of complicated reasons it didn't happen, but it didn't mean that people didn't want it. It was one of the biggest stories in sports for that whole from 1908 all the way to 1915, when Johnson lost to Jess Willard. But anyway, going back down the bottom row, both Walcott brothers, young Peter Jackson. There's Andy Watson. That's a photo I found. I hadn't really seen a picture of him before. I found that in the archives. There's Patsy Sweeney. There's a photo I found of Joe Jeanette, a babyface Joe Jeanette from the 1905 newspaper. That's the earliest photo I've seen of him, myself at least. And then George Cole. There's a picture I found in the archives of George Cole in a really badass turtleneck sweater. And that isn't a photo that I had seen until I dug it up just as part of this Sam Langford research and researching his opponents and trying to get a better grip on the nuanced texture of this time. It's very busy, as you know, Josh. So that brings us, I guess let's just recap where we've come to so far. Do you want to do a quick Johnson recap, just describing the shape in very simple terms? We've got about 20 minutes here, so do you want to just take a few minutes and just very quickly describe the shape leading up to the opening of the 1906 season?
Yeah, thanks, Random. Yeah, and one of the things I actually wanted to do also just kind of look back at those opponents opponents that he faced, and just kind of provide some insight, additional insight that is just based on an understanding in what was reported as far as the styles and the capabilities of those opponents at the time. So um, then I pulled up the picture that shows the varying opponents that Johnson competed with, and starting with Hank Griffin. I think earlier I said he might have been shorter than Johnson, but he was actually an inch taller than Johnson. That had to double back, but yeah, Hank Griffin, inch taller than Johnson, solidly built fighter, and I'll preface again by saying yeah, wanted to highlight just the fact that these are the types of opponents that Johnson was facing prior to him getting to Sam Langford, which of course is the ultimate goal of what this series will cover, the Sam Langford piece. But prior to him getting to Sam Langford, who is uh, widely regarded as the greatest fighter of all time, this kind of puts a little bit more emphasis on the fighters he faced. But yeah, Griffin, as mentioned, tough, lean fighter from that time who was very well traveled in terms of having fought a number of different styles and a number of the top heavyweights who were competing. So that adds to the experience factor. Joe Jeanette, uh, really hard to sum up Joe Jeanette's career in a single setting, but one of the best all around boxers the sport has ever seen. And I think he showed that over the course of his career through his series of fights with the likes of Johnson, as well as the others he competed with, i.e., Sam Langford, Sam McVeigh, Harry Wills, etc. And this kind of gives you a glimpse into just the types of opponents that Johnson was facing, and the same for Langford. Of course, essentially, Langford, he was fighting at a higher pace in terms of number of fights over the course of his career. And that wouldn't slow down even as he got to the back end. And he would ultimately fully surpass Johnson in total fights, essentially double him. And that's just kind of the fighter that Sam Langford was. He was very game, and he was one who, when fighting is mentioned as his job, certainly it was his job, and that's how he made his money. So he would fight anywhere, anytime, without a doubt. But also Sam McVeigh, I wanted to mention, of course, stylistic. I mentioned this is a tough, strong, sort of solidly just muscled fighter, and you can see that in the video that I previously did. Stylistically, he was actually a bit more skilled than some give him credit for. And the thing that made him stand out was his power, and he could work his trade from the inside for sure and rough up opponents. So if it meant that you were going to be clinching on the inside, it's going to be a lot of wrestling, tugging, pushing, and all of that stuff. He was game for it, and he had the physique to help him last for that type of stuff. And we know he famously fought Joe Jeanette in that 49 round fight. And while he ultimately lost that fight, he walked away from that fight with the knowledge that he was one of the toughest boxers the sport has seen, period. Both of those individuals. And they may have been down and out multiple times, but they kept getting up. So this is now Johnson fought him, of course, early in his career, but this just kind of highlights what he would become. Then, as mentioned, Denver Ed Martin, another one of those rugged guys who was in with a lot of the tough opponents from the time. 6'3", he was solidly built, more of a 6'3" that was on, I guess you could say, the slender side. So weight wise, he wasn't huge in that sense, but he knew how to use his length and range, and that saw him to many victories. So he was in with others at the time who were considered or looking to be on that trajectory of being top level. Bob Armstrong was one of those who was around the same size as him, more of a muscular build, but Armstrong, of course, had problems with the likes of Martin because he was crafty enough to be able to use his length and size in the proper manner. And then, of course, Black Bill. I don't know a ton about Black Bill, but I know that from a resume perspective, um, he was in with the pretty much the top guys at the time, and he found some success. He didn't win them all, of course. He lost to some of the more prominent fighters. He's about 6 foot, and he was a battle tested fighter for sure. Could say that, but this was another opponent who I mentioned that helped usher in that growth for Jack Johnson. Of course, Marvin Hart. Well, I guess you can say a moderately skilled fighter, and he was able to get some wins over the course of his career, but not someone we would consider to be, if we did a trajectory of all of the world heavyweight champion and ranked them based on how we felt, both from the standpoint of uh, just our emotional thoughts around their career and what they were able to do, as well as looking at their resumes, things of that nature. Yeah, he's not going to be one that ranks too high on that list, but he was able to work his way into the right place at the right time, of course. And I want to touch on Frank Childs, who is, as I mentioned, a multi-time colored heavyweight champion, a compact fighter. He's about 5'9", but he he had a lot of girth to him in every bit of that 5'9". He would come in probably just under 200 pounds, but he was routinely used to fighting guys who were bigger than him, and he packed enough of pop to be able to knock out these bigger guys, and that's what made him successful. Because if he could get within range and he could lay hands on you, he could do enough damage, and that's what saw him be able to take out some of these bigger guys like Denver Ed Martin, to be in there competing with the likes of Jack Johnson, Klondike Haynes, etc., stopping them and or stopping him. But for Frank Childs, he's a guy who goes vastly underrated, not mentioned often, but when you look at the colored world heavyweight title and the varying range, yeah, he has to ranks amongst those that are highly regarded and, as mentioned, underrated. He was in tough schedule, very tough schedule, and he was able to do this at 5'9" and weighing less than 200 pounds, but he just had a mix. His nickname was the Crafty Texan, so I think that speaks to just his intellect and his skills as a fighter. I kind of touched on Klondike John Haynes a little bit earlier. Big, lengthy guy. He too was uh, sort of that mold of kind of Denver Ed Martin, not an overly muscled guy or anything, but big, solid guy. Big Sandy Ferguson, big guy who could pack a punch, and I think that helped him in terms of what he was able to do with his career, and being able to compete with the best heavyweights of the era. It, and it and I think it benefited him in the long run, because when you look at his resume, you'll see that he did have some pretty solid success. And I think that's primarily because he was able to use his size and his strength to the best of his abilities. He's not going to wow. He wasn't the type, from what I understand, to wow you on the skills department, but he knew enough to be able to work his trade from his own sort of understanding of what his body was capable of. Uh, then, of course, George Gardner. I've run across George Gardner a number of times in competition with a lot of the top level guys in the in or around light heavyweight at that particular time. And Random had mentioned some of his mentioned his brothers or whatever. So of course that helps from the standpoint of you're in a fighting family. That helps to build you up to be able to be prepared for any varying styles that come about. And from my understanding of George Gardner, very solid boxer, skilled. He fought in probably the a little bit prior to, of course, him meeting Jack Johnson, he had fought some of his better fights against some of the competition that was really making their name there in the late 1800s. And George Gardner, yeah, from my understanding of what I know of him, very skilled fighter, um, and I think he's of Irish descent, or at least him and his family, of course, came to the U.S. and he competed with top level competition. I mean, I think if you really want to measure the sort of the true worth of a fighter, you look at who they fought. Yeah, because as I mentioned, you can build up a record. Um, and varying fighters have wins and losses, but it comes down to who you actually fought. And Gardner was one of those guys who was in with the best of him. And of course, Chewinski and young Peter Jackson, touched on Chewinski, young Peter Jackson. I think you kind of highlighted his capabilities there, random, but Peter Jackson for sure was one of those fighters who goes underrated, tough, could handle and take a lot of punishment, dish it out. Being a smaller fighter, he was only about 5'6", but you couldn't tell him that he wasn't a heavyweight because he would compete and prove it himself with his fists. So that just speaks to the level of competition that Johnson was facing, just kind of leading up to this point, and before he even got to the point of fighting for the world heavyweight title. And I think it speaks volumes, in my opinion, when you really break it down, competition wise, and look at each fighter on their individual merits.
Yeah, good stuff, Josh. Well put. Yeah, I think so I think this is probably a good stopping point, especially as I just have a couple moments before work. But folks, hopefully we've helped sort of enlighten the uninitiated or just gratify the initiated, trying to frame these great careers. At least we've gotten up to the 1905 season. In part two, we'll talk about 1905, 1906, and then depending on how the time goes, we may even do the 1907 or 8 seasons. I guess we're going to wing it. We were hoping to get through their first meeting, but we didn't get to it in this show. But thanks for tuning in so much. Thanks for your interest in both history and pugilism. And Josh, thank you so much for your time. This is really appreciated, sir. I know you put a lot of content out on your channel, 86 Boxing. You're on Facebook, you're on Twitter, you're on everywhere, but the YouTube channel, go check out his YouTube channel, folks, and maybe I can link some things in the description of this. But Josh, thanks for your time, brother. Any closing thoughts?
No, thank you, Random. Of course, always happy to come and jump in to have discussions on the history. And I appreciate the fact that that you're having these discussions. Hey, I'm just happy to be a part of it. I think as we continue to dive into more of these fighters' histories, that only adds to the legacy, and it's a good thing. And I commend all who have an interest and choose to kind of speak on and engage on these great fighters. So kudos to you, and looking forward to the next one.
Great, brother. Well, folks, we're going to call it. Thanks for joining us. Shout out to everyone in the chat. Thanks for listening after the fact. And look for part 2 coming up most likely early next week. Thanks again, Josh, and take care, folks.